We are continuing our series, Faithful Regardless, a study of the book of 1 Samuel. And it's the adventures of David at this point in his life running from Saul, who's trying to kill him. Trying to kill him just because he's extremely jealous of him. Saul is becoming insanely jealous, literally insanely jealous, chasing after David, wanting to kill him or kill anyone that protects him or stands up for him. And so when we last saw David, he's trying to find refuge in the Philistine city of Achish, and he pretends to be insane so they wouldn't recognize him, but they do. And he runs away, and he runs off, and he finds refuge in a cave. In fact, 1 Samuel 22:1, it started out, David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Now, Gath was the city where Achish lived. It was also the hometown of Goliath. So he was already public enemy number one there. And he found refuge, and he ran away, and he hid in this cave of Adullam. It was there in that cave where something happened to David that transformed him. It changed the directory of what he was doing and where he was going. I called it Dave's cave, because in this cave, he cried out to the Lord. He cried out in humility. He cried out in repentance. We know this because somewhere in that cave, or about that cave, he wrote Psalm 142. And in Psalm 142, he tells what's going on viscerally in his heart, in his emotions, crying out to the Lord. In fact, Psalm 142:5 says, I cry to you, Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I am in desperate need. Rescue me from those who pursue me. And God did. God saw the humility of his heart, answered his prayer, and rescued him. Soon his family came to him. Soon there was about 400 men who were distressed and discontented themselves, who gathered around to follow him, and they eventually became his army. And then soon Abiathar, the priest, the son of the priest who had been killed by Saul from the city of Nob, just for hosting David and helping him. Abiathar, becomes priest and counselor. Now the Lord is with David now. He's blessing him now. David's no longer running in pride and his arrogance. He's waiting upon the Lord. He's seeking the Lord. Very important. And he's no longer taking matters into his own hands. And you see what he does. He cries out to the Lord. He seeks the Lord. He inquires of the Lord. He listens to the Lord. And the Lord answers him. And the Lord gives him his favor. So when we enter into chapter 23, David is in the small beginnings of building his army and following the Lord in this manner. 1 Samuel 23, first 5 verses says this. When David was told, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting the threshing floors, he inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord answered him, go, attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, here in Judah we're afraid. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces? So, verse 4, once again, David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, go down to Keilah, for I am going to give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah. They fought the Philistines. They carried off their livestock. He inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. This victory in Keilah is an example how David is now operating in the power of God and the will of God, because he's seeking God and obeying God. You hear what I said? He's operating in the power of God and the will of God because he's seeking God and obeying God. And this victory, this Keilah victory, is the first of David's independent campaign. He's no longer fighting under Saul's banner. This is David's army, and God gave him victory. Now, he's still being pursued by Saul, and while he's being pursued by Saul, he's experiencing trouble. He's experiencing betrayal and rejection, people that he meets. He's no longer acting in desperation and self-sufficiency, but people are acting against him, even though he's seeking God and obeying God regularly. And I want to tell you something. This is the secret to David's success. You know, it's the secret to all we do. If we're seeking God, no matter what comes against us, no matter what prevailing winds pound against us or the winds of adversity come against us, and I mean people and situations and circumstances coming against us, the only way that we can find victory is not on our own self-sufficiency, not thinking we're so good at what we do and we're so secure and operating on our own strength, but checking with God, relying on his strength, inquiring about his will for our next move. Now, David was starting this a new way for him, a new MO for him. Now, it's clear that Saul wanted to kill him, and he also wanted to intimidate others to turn against David. But David continues to seek, and God leads, and David follows, and God guides, and God protects, and David is in God's care. Verse 7 says this: Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, God has delivered him into my hands, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars. And Saul called up his forces for battle, to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. When David learned that Saul was plotting against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, bring me the ephod. Bring me the ephod. Well, the ephod is a priestly garment used during the worship or even seeking the Lord. This is no ordinary piece of clothing. Very elaborate, very ornate. In verse 10, it says this: David said, Lord God of Israel, your servant has heard definitely that Saul plans to come to Keilah and destroy the town on account of me. Will the citizens of Keilah surrender him to me? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? Lord God of Israel, tell your servants. And the Lord said, he will. And again, David asked, will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul? And the Lord said, they will. So David realizes he's not safe in Keilah. Even though he helped save this whole town from the Philistines who were pounding up against them, they were going to turn him over, and God let him know. Even though David had just got finished rescuing their entire city, all the people from the Philistines, God revealed that David was not safe here. Now, they probably feared Saul just the way, everyone else did. They had probably heard about what he did to the people of Nob, killed all the people just for helping David with bread and a sword. Now, David must have felt betrayed. He must have felt betrayed by these people in Keilah. He thought he was safe there. But even though he knew what they were about to do, he did not act in anger. He didn't have bitterness towards them. He just pretty much wiped his feet and he moved on. So verse 13 says, so David and his men, about 600 in number now, left Keilah and kept moving from place to place. When Saul was told that David had escaped Keilah, he did not go there. And David stayed in the wilderness strongholds, in the hills of the deserts of Ziph. Day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. You see, David was on the run. Saul knew about where he was, but God allowed David to elude Saul. God was hiding and protecting David. Now, verse 15, while David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he heard that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. Don't be afraid, he said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father knows this. The two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. Let's remember that. Because Jonathan was David's closest friend, and he had a covenant with David. He honored his covenant with David, and he probably risked his life to go and speak to him here in Horesh. But he wanted to encourage him. He wanted to help him. And Jonathan tells David, my father will not lay a hand on you. He also tells David that you will be king, David. And he also says to David, I, Jonathan, will serve as second under you in your kingdom. Now, only two of those things eventually came to pass. Saul did not ever catch up with David. I gave the end of the story away, but you know it's in the Bible. David did become king, and that was prophesied. He's already been anointed, just not appointed king of Israel. But Jonathan never became the second to David. Jonathan never became second to David. I'll talk about that in a second. But this meeting at Horesh between these two very close friends, listen, this is the last time that these two men ever saw each other. That's it. This was their last and final meeting. The last and final meeting between these two. Now, verse 19 said, the Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah and said, is not David hiding among us in the strongholds of Horesh on the hill of Achalah? south of Jeshimon. Now your majesty, come down whenever it pleases you to do so, and we will be responsible for giving him into your hands. See, it seems like the Ziphites found that they could win the favor of Saul by disclosing David's hiding places. They do it here. In fact, they'll do it again in chapter 26. This is the Ziphites, always exposing David's hiding places. In verse 21, Saul replies, "The Lord bless you for your concern for me. Go and get more information. Find out where David usually goes and who has seen him there. They tell me he's very crafty. Find out about all the hiding places he uses and come back to me with definite information. Then I will go with you. If he is in the area, I will track him down among all the clans of Judah." So they're going to go and try to find him. Now you hear a lot of places being mentioned. You hear of Horesh, you hear of Ziph, Moan, Arabah, Jeshimon, Hakilah. This is all in the wilderness, south of Hebron, and just west of En-Gedi, where David ends up spending a lot of time. This is all along the Dead Sea. So these are small villages along the Dead Sea region, south of Hebron. Verse 24, they set out and went to Ziph, ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the desert of Maon, in the Arabah south of Jeshimon. Saul and his men began to search, and when David was told about it, he went to the rock and stayed in the desert of Maon. When Saul heard this, he went into the desert of Maon to pursue David. As Saul was going along one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side, hurrying to get away from Saul. And as Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul saying, "Come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land." Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. And this is why they call this place Selah Hamalakath. Selah Hamalakath. And they went up there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. The Selah Hamalakath, this is the place of escape. Some will call it the rock of escape or the cliff of divisions. And this plays into chapter 26 again when David and Saul David's calling out to Saul and they're having a conversation over this canyon in Selah Hamalakath. Saul's army at this point was about 3,000 trained militiamen with Abner at his command. And remember, David's got about 600 men. But they have David pinned between the wilderness mountains and the Dead Sea. David could not escape. If you've ever been there, the wilderness mountains are, very foreboding cliffs up into the Judean desert, but the slope goes down, and the Red Sea, the Dead Sea. There's not much place to escape. Now think about this. They would have been captured. They would have been overcome by Saul's army if there wasn't an interruption. An interruption from someone who said, "Saul, you got to get back home. The Philistines are attacking our homeland," basically. So Saul broke off his pursuit of David. Only 2 chapters ago, David was all alone in a cave. And now he is with his own army, actually being directed and protected by the Lord. His small army is growing. He's hearing from the Lord regularly. So far in this story, so much has happened. Even in what we just read, he's had victory over Keilah, a victory in Keilah over the Philistines. Major victory to start off his career, basically, as a king leader. He's able to elude Saul by going place to place, even though there are people trying to rat him out, including the Ziphites. He saw this miracle hand of God protect Saul, protect him from Saul just when Saul was closing in on him right there in the wilderness of Maon. And he's regularly humbling himself before the Lord, regularly writing his feelings into Psalms. And in this, he's finding a well of strength somewhere. In fact, in chapter 54, just like we read last week, this chapter, Psalm 54, is a direct correlation to this time of David's life. In fact, it says this in Psalm 54, you'll like this, "For the director of music with stringed instruments, a maskil," which is a song of David, "when the Ziphites had gone to Saul and said, 'Is David not hiding among us?'" That's when he wrote this. And he wrote, "Save me, O God, by your name. Vindicate me by your might. Hear my prayer, O God. Listen to the words of my mouth. Arrogant foes are attacking me. Ruthless people are trying to kill me. People without regard for God. Surely God is my help. The Lord is the one who sustains me. Let evil recoil on those who slander me. In their faithfulness, destroy them. I will sacrifice a freewill offering to you. I will praise your name, Lord, for it is good. You have delivered me from my troubles, and my eyes have looked in triumph on my foes. Isn't that beautiful? Verse 4, he said, surely God is my help. The Lord is the one who sustains me. He's found the secret strength of God's help, God's rescue, God's strength to rely upon and not his own. And this is key when he says, God is my help. He's the one who sustains me. See, David had no one to trust but God. I mean, really, think about it. These people, these Keilah people, the village of Keilah, he just rescued them, and they were about to turn him over to Saul and betray him. The Ziphites, he had no issue with them, but they were constantly going to Saul. At least they did it twice, who knows how many other times, telling Saul where David was hiding and saying, we'll go and get him for you. And Saul himself was not only pursuing David to kill him, but he's turning others against David. And to make matters worse, Saul is telling people that he's acting on behalf of God. In fact, when he spoke to the Ziphites, they said to him, Your Majesty, we'll be responsible for giving him into your hands. And Saul replied, the Lord bless you. The Lord bless you for your concern for me. Now go get more information. And even Jonathan, who was a close friend, and encouraged David, and showed tremendous compassion and loyalty to David. But remember what he said. There was 3 things he said to David. It was basically, probably not by intent, probably well-meaning, but 2 truths and a lie. 2 truths and a lie. Because he told David, my father will not lay a hand on you. True. You will be king over Israel. True. And I'll be second to you in the kingdom. Well, that never came to pass. Now, who knows why it never came to pass? It may have just not been God's will. Have you ever felt betrayed or exposed by people? Have you ever felt turned against or had others turn people against you? Have you ever felt misled by someone who's even a well-meaning friend? You know, it can happen to any of us, by anyone, even our closest friends. David, though, was not discouraged by all this. Why? Because he had a secret strength that he could draw from in times of encouragement, a secret strength. Now, it wasn't the sword of Goliath. It doesn't say that at that point David picked up the sword of Goliath that Abiathar had given him at Nob and he started, slashing down Saul's army. No, that doesn't even show up. I don't even know if he ever used that sword. But the secret to his secret strength was simple. It was not his own strength. It was that he learned to find the strength of God. He learned to find strength in God. During that final visit with Jonathan, there's something that happened. And something Jonathan helped him find that lasted David for the rest of his life. It happened in 1 Samuel 23:16. We've just passed right through it when we read it, but it said this: Jonathan went to David at Horesh, that final meeting, and helped him find strength in God. How did he do it? What did he do? You see, we see that at this point, David is finding a source of strength in God. Jonathan helped him to not rely on himself, not rely on his own selfish, faculties and abilities, but to find strength in God. David was able to do that. And that's why we read in Psalm 54 what he wrote at that time: Save me, God, by your name, and vindicate me by your strength, it says in the King James. This is so important to all of us. It's so important to David. In fact, he hit a time, probably 7 chapters from now, where it's even worse. It was maybe the lowest point in his life. Things got so bad at one point. Well, let me just read it. It's 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. And here's what happens. Just let me tell you. It's towards the end. He's distressed because he had a village of Ziklag that was given to him, and for his family and his friends and their families, and he would go out and fight. And he comes back to the village one day, and the village is burned to the ground. The families, the wives and the children are all taken captive, and they get there, and his men turned on him, and they wanted to kill him. Now that's a bad day. 1 Samuel 36, it says, David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. David found strength in the Lord his God. Somehow, he found the strength of God. And he eventually went out and pursued and got all the wives and children back and killed the enemy off. Somehow, he found strength. Don't you wish you could just do that? You can. You know, there's this story about Apollo 12. Apollo 12 is a rocket moon launch, went to the moon. It doesn't get much press because it happened a few months after Apollo 11, which was the big one in 1969. But this one happened not in the summer of 69, but in the fall, November of 69. And on its launch, on its liftoff, it was struck by lightning twice. Struck by lightning twice. You think that's pretty unlucky. But basically, I think it just created itself as some type of superconductor during liftoff. And anyway, the lightning knocked out some of the internal control batteries, things that they need to control the rocket. So the mission was about to be aborted when a young technician in the control center named John Aaron famously said these words. And I guess if you're into rocket science, NASA, this kind of thing, space exploration, you may have heard this. It says, tell him to try SCE to AUX, or AUX. Now, the ground commander had no idea what this young 25-year-old technician was saying, but he just, in his desperation, he just sent the message up to the rocket, try SCE to AUX. Now, basically what this means is switching from SCE to AUX means switching from the signal control equipment to the auxiliary power that was an extra power source that's in the rocket but was not being used for the controls. The astronauts on board, they just went ahead, flipped a few switches, and switched from SCE to AUX. And basically what they were doing is they were switching from their own power, which was depleted, to some auxiliary power that was within the rocket but was not being tapped. And the mission was saved. Think about that. David switched from his own power, his ability to be a tremendous war hero and be able to fight and kill 10,000s, and to be his own way of talented and charming himself. He comes with a lot of talents and abilities. But at this point, he has switched from that to just relying on God's power, God's direction, God's strength. He found strength in the Lord his God. What do you do when you're distressed, when you're discouraged, when you're bitter in spirit? Do you just despair? Do you look elsewhere for support? Maybe in people, maybe in resources, maybe in distractions? Do you try to muster up enough strength in and of yourself, self-determination that just kind of plow through it, struggle through it? Or do you find strength in God? Friends, we all are tempted to look elsewhere other than finding strength in God. We're tempted because that's what the enemy wants us to do. But friends, we have to find our strength in God. We get to a point where we're so depleted, we become so discouraged, we become so downtrodden. The adversity of the world, the enemy pounds against us. Maybe we're just depleted because we've overexerted ourselves, our resources. And we're discouraged and we're depleted. And instead of trying to find it in yourself, can we find strength through the power of the Holy Spirit? That's finding strength in God. It's just like knowing what to do when your cell phone dies. When your cell phone's on 3%, 2%, 1%, there's nothing you could do. You can't press the buttons really hard. You can't shake it around. You can't tap it frantically. You can't, find some app that recharges it on its own. You just got to surrender and say, it can't do it on itself. I have to plug it in to a power source. The only difference between us and our cell phone is the power source that we're talking about is in us and all around us. God is our power source. We have to learn to find strength in him, just like David. How do we find strength in God? We just basically surrender. We surrender and we declare that we're weak, and we declare that we're completely dependent on him. Just like your cell phone when it's on 1%. It declares that as fancy as it is and as clever as it is, it needs power that it just doesn't have. And it's not until we get to that point admitting our weakness, that we could switch from our power to his power. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10 says this, "My strength is made perfect in weakness, for when I am weak, then I am strong." Now, Paul is saying this the same way David says, my strength is only made perfect when I declare that I am weak. For when I am weak, he, God, is strong. Let's not pretend to be powerful. Let's welcome our weakness. Why? Because when we are weak, he is strong. When you are weak, find strength in the Lord your God. God bless you.